For hundreds of years, sailors faced a deadly mystery. Out on the open ocean, with no land in sight, they could not tell exactly where they were. Whole fleets sailed blind, and thousands of men died on hidden rocks, simply because no one could solve it. The greatest scientists in the world tried and failed. In the end, the answer came from a poor country carpenter who had almost no schooling, and it would cost him nearly his entire life. Some people change the world, and the world never learns their name. This is without whom. The mystery was called longitude. At sea, you could work out how far north or south you were by reading the sun and the stars. That was the easy half. But there was no way to know how far east or west you had traveled. A ship could be hundreds of miles from where its captain believed it was. Out on the water, that mistake was not just embarrassing, it was deadly. Without longitude, every long voyage was a gamble. Ships missed their islands and ran out of food and water. Sailors starved or fell sick, lost on an empty sea. Others sailed straight onto rocks they never saw coming. For a nation that lived and died by its ships, this could not be ignored forever. Then, in 1707, the nightmare came true on a terrible scale. A fleet of British warships, certain of their position, smashed into the rocks off the coast of England in the dark. In a single night, as many as 2,000 sailors drowned. The whole country was shaken. It was brutally clear. Until someone solved longitude, no ship and no life at sea was ever truly safe. So the government did something extraordinary. Parliament offered a staggering reward, a fortune, to anyone in the world who could find a reliable way to measure longitude at sea. It became the great scientific challenge of the age. The finest minds in Europe took it up, and almost all of them looked for the answer in the same place. Up in the night sky, in the movements of the moon and stars. But one man looked somewhere else entirely. His name was John Harrison. He was not a scholar, and he was not an astronomer. He was a carpenter, the son of a carpenter, from a small English village. He had almost no schooling. He had taught himself from nothing how to build clocks, carving the very parts out of wood. He had no money, no powerful friends, and no place in the world of science. Harrison had a simple, brilliant idea. Time and longitude are really the same thing. If you carry a clock that always shows the exact time back home and compare it to the local time where your ship is, the difference tells you precisely how far around the world you have come. Solve the clock, and you solve longitude. There was just one impossible problem standing in the way. No clock on Earth could keep accurate time at sea. On land, a steady pendulum keeps a clock honest, but on a ship, everything fights against it. The deck rolls and pitches. Heat and cold make the metal parts swell and shrink. Salt air eats at the gears. Every clock ever made fell hopelessly out of time after a few days on the water. John Harrison set out to build one that never would. He poured himself into the work. After years of effort, he produced his first great machine, a strange and beautiful thing of shining brass, full of swinging weights and springs, built to ignore the motion of the sea. In 1736, it was carried aboard a Navy ship for a real test on the open ocean, and it worked. On the voyage home, Harrison corrected the ship's own officers about their position, and he was right. It was a triumph. He could have stopped there and demanded his reward. But John Harrison was a perfectionist, almost painfully so. He looked at his wonderful machine and saw only its flaws. So he set it aside and started over, determined to build something better. And then he did it again. One clock became years of work. Years became decades. Think about what that means. Harrison gave the best years of his life to this single quest. While other men built families and fortunes, he sat bent over tiny gears, chasing a perfection almost no one else even understood. The reward was waiting. And still he worked, year after lonely year, refusing to settle for good enough. Then, at last, came the breakthrough. After nearly 30 years, Harrison realized the answer was not a giant machine at all. It was a watch. He built a timekeeper small enough to hold in your hands, a masterpiece of tiny moving parts that ticked 5 times every second. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen. This humble little watch could do what no clock in all of history had managed. In 1761, the moment of truth arrived. Harrison's son carried the precious watch on a long voyage across the Atlantic, all the way to the Caribbean. The crossing took 81 days. When they finally checked the watch against the true time, the result was almost unbelievable. After nearly 3 months at sea, it had lost only a few seconds. The problem that had defeated the whole world for centuries was solved. It should have been the happiest day of his life. Instead, it was the start of a heartbreak. The board of powerful men who controlled the reward did not want to believe that a carpenter had won. Many of them were astronomers who had spent their careers backing the rival method of the moon and stars. They declared the test must have been pure luck, and they refused to pay. So they changed the rules. They demanded another voyage, then another test. They ordered Harrison to take his life's work apart, piece by piece, and explain every hidden secret to other clockmakers. They took his timekeepers out of his hands. An old man who had given everything was now treated like a cheat, forced to prove himself over and over while they held back what he was owed. And John Harrison fought back. Now in his 70s, frail and exhausted, he refused to surrender what he knew was rightfully his. It was a bitter, lonely battle, one ordinary man standing against the most powerful scientific authorities in the land. For years it dragged on, and it seemed he might die forgotten, cheated out of the recognition he had earned 100 times over. Then help came from the most unlikely place of all. The king himself, George III, heard about the old clockmaker's struggle. He had one of Harrison's timekeepers tested with his own eyes, and he was amazed by how well it kept time. Angered by how badly Harrison had been treated, the king threw his weight behind him and insisted that this honest man finally be given his due. With the king on his side, the tide finally turned. In 1773, Parliament voted to reward John Harrison for what he had given the world. He was 80 years old. After a lifetime of struggle, he had his recognition and his money at last. He lived just 3 more years and died in 1776, an old man who had finally been proven right. But his true reward was far greater than money. Harrison's invention changed the world forever. Copies of his watch spread to ships across the oceans. One of them sailed with the famous explorer Captain Cook, who came to trust it completely. For the first time in history, sailors could cross any sea and know exactly where they were. Maps grew accurate. Trade and travel exploded, and countless lives that would have been lost on the rocks were quietly saved. Think of it. A poor carpenter with no fortune and no schooling solved a problem that had defeated kings, scholars, and the greatest scientists in the world. And he did it by giving up nearly his whole life to get it exactly right. His timekeepers still run today, behind glass in a museum, as steady and true as the day he made them. The world you live in was built by people you have never heard of. And now you know one more name: John Harrison. Like and subscribe and stick around, because the textbooks left a lot out. Thanks for watching.